Hello, everybody. I hope you can hear me loud and clear. This is Galileo Disperati. I work for Martel Innovate, which is one of the partners in WeNet project. Thanks again for your interest in the webinar. Everybody is ready to go, so I'll just quickly give you a little set of rules for the call, and then we get straight to the program. We just kindly request all the participants to keep microphones muted at any time. There's going to be space for questions, but please use the chat for your questions. We'll have a couple of sessions for this, one after the central panel, and then there will be a little bit of discussions after Batya Friedman's talk. This webinar is being recorded, and the recording and the presentations that you are seeing will be sent to participants and made available on the project website after the webinar. Okay, without further ado, I'll just leave the floor to the project coordinator, Fausto Giunchiglia, which will give us an introduction to the project. Please, Fausto.
Thank you. Welcome everybody. So I hope you hear me well. So let me just briefly summarize the vision of the project. Please next. And Galileo, next slide. So next. So what is the key concept? The key concept is really, the idea is that right now in the net, there are a lot of people which are very diverse, and that clearly the network, the internet connects people basically in zero time, independent of space. Still, we are in a situation where people are very different and they don't know one another. Not only they don't know one another personally, but they also don't know one another's culture, customs, and competencies. And this is actually a big difficulty because ultimately we are not really able to exploit fully the capabilities that we have for the network. In principle, if you think about it, we could really ask for help for anybody in the world, independent of where they are. So this is the goal that we're trying to solve, how we can really think of a new technology which will allow us to connect people by being diversity aware, but they're actually being able to take advantage of diversity at the same time, going over the difficulties that deal with different people and people which are diverse from us arises. Next slide, please. How we do this? So think about, you have to get two people to talk to one another, but those two people are different. How you enforce that? How you can provide a technology which will enable two people anywhere in the world to communicate? First of all, they have to know one another, and that's really why you need to build a profile. But then a profile which must be diversity aware, must be a profile which is able to accommodate for the different instances. Second of all, and not only, sorry, let me go a little bit on this, not only this profile must be aware of GDPR, a layer of privacy, so that the fact that you make yourself available for interaction with others doesn't mean that all of a sudden everybody knows everything about you. Second, to support that now we make public our profile, how do people find it? How we can actually enable this? And support that we now have succeeding in finding the right person. How do I talk to this person? I mean, here all of a sudden you are in front of a person that you have never met and that you don't know. How can we help you? How can the system help you in setting up this kind of collaboration? And then of course, last but not least, from a technological point of view, how do we convince people to participate to this WeNet community, as we call it? And of course, all of this just because of the sensibility, we have to be fully ethical and privacy aware, as I said before. So that's the key idea. And let me just say that, I'll say that in a second. We have this technology in place, as later on you'll know more, and we have actually just already applied to universities all over the world with like thousands of students, hundreds I should say, but also getting into the thousands depending on how you count, we've used it. So, and so we have some experimental evidence that all these approaches some hope to succeed at least. So not only that, but we really want to make all this technology available because open source, which is something that we've already done. Not only, we also want to make available the data that we collect, of course, in the GDPR aware and and also ethically in the proper way. And because we really want to make both the technology and the data we collect as the infrastructure of the European innovation ecosystem. But Europe, to start from Europe to reach anywhere, because we see this is something really global. And as a matter of fact, the next slide, please. I think next one. So what are the objectives? The objectives, as I said, objective number one, to do the technology and science. Objective number two, we want to make we want to make the platform available online, which we already have done. Number three, we did, as I said before, we are doing pilots with universities in all the different continents, more or less. We're missing Oceania, but we do have them South America and Africa, and Africa we don't have, but we pretty much have a place from South America, Europe, and Asia. And then we want to make all of this data available so that we can do community building and finally, as I said, ethical guidance. So please, next slide. So all of these, here we are. So finally, we have the parts so you can check your stuff, which continents are missing. So this is where these are the partners, not only the part, but these are also the kind of the areas where we're piloting the work. So these are, I think, has been a major effort to do, but also a very good opportunity for learning. The technology that we have is actually being tested in most of these places, and actually in all these places, I should say, and properly. And we have collected lots of data, terabytes of data, which became gigabytes of data after preparation, which are now available for reuse. Next slide. But all of these to tell you that the general idea, but as a prerequisite, some way of introducing, next slide, please, the idea in concrete. Let us see a concrete example. So we said that we want to make a technology which will enable any two people in the world to interact, even people that you never met, so that one can help the other. Next, sorry, next. Just please go to the full slide, please, Galileo. So this is the kind of example. So we have a random person anywhere that could be want to have lunch together. Could have lunch, but could ask for help for anything. Could ask for information. So now, what is the difference from the state of the art? The difference from the state of the art that now is sends a query, and sends a query because different from now in the social networks, we really we don't need to know who is the person, and then the system will say, okay, we look into the information WeNet has about the request by Bob. He knows about Bob. He knows about Carlos, Jack, or whatever, and we'll ask among not all people, a subset of the people, the proper ones, the correct ones, and we have to, of course, to make precise what correct means. Who wants to add? Next. And then, of course, someone will answer. We go to the end of the example, please, one more. And then ultimately, and the people, we say, we find some people, next to Galileo, and then we say, in the end, Bob will find the right one, hopefully. Okay, so this is a kind of scenario, next Galileo. And that is the desire. Okay, so suppose that we want to have this scenario. How do we do this? Can you go to the next slide, please? Right, so this is that I'm describing now is really the kind of problem, scientific and technological problem that you have to solve. This is also, by the way, correspond to technologies available now in the platform and actually services. So number one, you need to search for the unknown. What you see on the right is an ego network. And then, of course, the issue that sometimes you know the person for solving the problem, but you all know that a lot of people, a lot of time we We have problems that we don't know how to solve. So the first one, we search for the know. How do I find the right person among the people that I do not necessarily know? Next one. Second is, how do I convince them to participate? Notice that this is a network where you participate both as a producer, as a helper, and also as a consumer, now as someone being helped. So this network works only if there is a good incentive for people to participate. If only one participates, then it's not going to work. Next one. Then, as I said, there's a lot of technology which will enable people to set up the right interaction modality. Next, but okay. Next step. What is the next step? Right. Well, as you know, we are all busy. So for John to answer Bob must be free. So we have a technology that allows for, if you participate to the network, to compute automatically, to compute what you're doing, where you are, and make it visible up to a point, being still aware of GDPR, which means that the system for you will not bother you if you're busy. Next one. At the same time, we provide all the information about the conversational context. At the beginning, I was talking about the ego network. The system will produce some kind of ego network level so that the system will know what are the people which are more likely to be okay for you. Next one. All of this, now we got to the bottom line, to be diversity aware. The diversity, like ethics, is really some kind of transversal scientific modeling that you have done, which enables all this technology, because all the previous technologies that we shown above only work if the system is able to accommodate all the different diversity from people, differences from people, at the same time to be still ethical in the interactions. One last word, and then I'm done. There are usually two types of diversity. The most diverse, diversity about gender, nationality. These are kind of the dimensions of diversity that don't play much role. They should not play much role. But the kind of diversity that we care a lot about is the second one, what you call the D properties, because you want to know someone because of their culture, for their competence, their personality. A lot of work has been done in this project. You'll get more about this later on, about modeling this type of diversity and make sure that they are made available in the profile, still in a diversity aware and ethical aware modality. Next. Ethics I already said, as I said, is all about preserving privacy and also making sure that all the issues that should not play a role do not play a role in a negative sense. The next one. So here there are other scenarios that we can consider. They're just there to show some examples, but pretty much the situation as before. Someone needs help, and there are different types of help, and then WeNet will accommodate for the right help to be provided if possible. Thank you. Next one. These are the partners, and as you see, we have partners from all over the world. Besides Europe, we have like China, India, Mexico, and Paraguay, and pretty much also in Europe, we have a good coverage of nations. Next one. That's it. So I hope, despite a very short amount of time, I gave an idea of WeNet. Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to give this short presentation. Thank you, Galileo. Back to you.
Thanks, Fausto. I will just give the floor directly to George for our panel. Please, George.
Right. Hello, everyone. I'm George Gasco. I'm an emeritus professor of social psychology and research methodology at the London School of Economics. And I'm a member of the WeNet consortium. Now, in his introduction, Fausto flagged up this key role of diversity in the WeNet project. And just to emphasize the importance of diversity in contemporary times, I'd like to read you a quote from the Confederation of British Industry, which was emailed to me this morning. They say, the pandemic has turned our lives and the world of work upside down. As the economy is recovering, companies have the unique opportunity to go back to the drawing board and reimagine the current diversity and inclusion practices. Improving gender and ethnic representation at all levels of businesses will remain critical. And I was really, happen chance that came on my email this morning, and I thought, no, I really ought to draw that to your attention. It's not just academics who are worrying about these issues. So what I'd like to do is just introduce 4 of my colleagues in the project. They are going to introduce their disciplinary perspective on diversity, and then we'll open it up for a general discussion. And my 4 colleagues, the first one is Daniel Gatica Perez. He directs the Social Computing Lab at a institute in Switzerland, and he's a professor in the École Polytechnique de Lausanne in Switzerland. His research is supported by the Swiss National Research Foundation, European Commission, and it's really a focus on designing mobile and media computing technologies that support communities and individuals. My second colleague is Professor Ivano Bison, and he is a professor of sociology at the University of Trento in Italy. He's a quantitative sociologist, and he's working on operationalizing a theory from luminaries such as Pierre Bourdieu in France and Tony Giddens in the UK, called social practice theory. Then we have Amalia de Goetzen, who is a professor at Aalborg University and a member of the Service Design Lab. Amalia's research is at the intersection between design and services, and how data can be creatively employed in different phases of the design process. And finally, and not least, so to speak, is Paula Helm, who's trained in anthropology and peace studies, peace and conflict studies. She's a fellow of the International Center for Ethics in the Sciences at the University of Tübingen in Germany. And her research is on the intersection between science, technology studies, and ethics. Now, each of the panel members is going to give a short presentation on what diversity means in relation to their disciplinary orientation. I may ask the panel to elaborate on a few points, but I do want to open it up to you, the audience, for questions that you may have for the panel. So we'll start with you, Daniel. Take it away, please.
Thank you, George. When George asked us to think about how important diversity is in our community, I thought about 3 points. The first one, if we move to the next slide, is about the diversity of people whose data is used today to build computing technologies. And I think we have all seen examples in the last few years, if you move to the next point, please, of how there are many underrepresented groups in each society. But in addition to that, there are also underrepresented world regions. And this creates very serious implications for machine learning. So if we move to the next slide, just as an example of the many that I'm sure you have seen in the academic literature or in the news, this is a well-known example that shows the geographic distribution of 2 well-known databases for images that have been used to train deep learning visual recognition methods. The one on the right is the most famous one, the ImageNet database. And if we just focus on that one for a moment, you can see that half of the images essentially come from 2 countries, the US and Great Britain. And you can see how many other countries are represented there, but certainly not proportionally to the population or to the size of the territory. The second point that is an important one in the context of diversity in computing, if we move to the next slide, is about the diversity of people who build computing technologies. And if we move to the next point here, well, this is a well-known fact how women are underrepresented in computer science studies. These are data from the US, but also how other groups, in particular Hispanics and Blacks, are not only underrepresented with respect to the contribution to the overall population in the context of computer science, but also in the context of having jobs in technology companies. And as another example that is also well known in the literature, how in this particular case, only 4% of the winners of the highest recognition in computing are women. This is an issue that is well known and needs to be addressed. And the third point that I thought about computing and diversity has to do with what I think is at the core of the goals of the project. How can we design for diverse uses of computing technology? If we move to the next point, specifically how diversity can contribute to design technology that supports specific needs of certain groups, but also to address common problems. And I would like to finish this quick introduction leaving you with two quotes that show very different views of the world. The first one comes from Kai-Fu Lee from his well-known book called AI Superpowers, that talks about the important economic forces that are driving the specific domain of AI worldwide. And the second quote is from, if you move to the next point, from Catherine Ignacio and Lauren Klein from their book on data feminism, which essentially challenge this view and provide tools to rethink about, to rethink the future of AI and how we can empower ourselves as citizens to think otherwise. So with this, I finish my quick positioning, and thank you for your attention.
Okay, I am Ivano. I think that my turn to talk. Thanks, George, for the presentation. Just to starting, what is diversity? The problem of diversity is not so easy, because when we're thinking about diversity, we think on the gender diversity, we think at the ethics, the ethnicity diversity, and etc., etc. And unfortunately, this kind of approach about diversity, it's very limiting the possibility to think what is really diversity. The first element that we need to think that diversity is an characteristic of groups, and is not an individual characteristic. And so in this sense, the diversity is a relational concept. Next, please. In this perspective, diversity is used often as an umbrella term. And the problem is that mainly in the social science use, diversity is applied to race, ethnicity, gender, age, education, sexual orientation, political ability, religion, and so on. And it's become a very new terms, because in a sociology area, there is not usually to talking about diversity, because we have no other kind of terms to define in more deep diversity. However, diversity or diverse society is the way in which people within a community are perceived different and separate from each other. Element of diversity can include among gender, ethnicity, etc., etc., and often there are sources of bias, prejudice, stereotype, exclusion, and inequality. What's the problem? If we have this kind of perception of diversity, how we can leverage diversity? Because the consequence of all these are the focus on raising awareness of existence of diversity through its negative aspect has distracted attention from the other side of the coin. And how to harness diversity through exploitation with both individual and the whole community can benefit. What this means that we need to change the perspective, and change the perspective means to think diversity in a different way. Think diversity and social diversity is a richer, more complex and encompassing competence taste, preference, value, belief, and lifestyle, etc., etc. Next, please. Let me an example. In my department several years ago, there was an office where there are two people. Next, please. One was a man, another one was a woman. And what happened? Happened that people, when the computer doesn't work, go in the office. And what happened? They need to asking from one or the other one for to repair or have help for that kind of problem. Then the problem is, who do ask you for help, him or her? And usually people refer to the man. Next, please. But why they refer to the him or she? Because they having the skill, or because you assume she is having a skill? And next, please. And when our decision is based on the visible characteristic, on the probability that she's more competent than she, they are likely to evoke responses that are due to directly to bias, prejudice, and stereotype. What this means that often when we want to refer to diversity, often we have a problem that because we remain to observe just only what are the visible characteristics of the subject. Like I go to asking to the men instead for the women because I suppose that is the man, the expert computer technician. Then the problem becomes the visible and not visible characteristics. Next one, please. Then the step to move is to think to diversity from a problem to an research, an economic research. And when we move inside an economic research, what happens? We can mixing the two aspects. One is the relational aspect of diversity, and the second one is the possibility to think in diversity as an research, an economic research that we can share, sell, transfer, etc., etc. Then we have in diversity moment two elements. The first one is then at the initial categorization are accompanied by a perception of similarity. The similarity were based on surface level, demographic data. There's a perception change when deep level information is obtained. Over the time, as people acquire more information, their perception are based on more on the observation behavior and less on stereotype, driven by demographic characteristics. Next one. And this division between visible and not visible characteristics become the mind center idea of when we want to leverage diversity. From one side, we have demographic characteristics that are the surface diversity that are usually the place where we have prejudice, etc., etc. And from the other side, there is the part of diversity that we can leverage, that we can use, that we can share, that are the competence, that are the diversity that are related with the not visible characteristic. Next one. For to do that, we can thinking that diversity, we can summarize in three main macro categories. And three main macro categories are meaning, material, and competence. That are three elements that link it, but also across their competence to form a block of interconnected elements that are the practice. Next, please. The meaning is the material, the material is the covered physical aspect of performing practice, including the human body. This is the part of the visible elements of diversity and the most problematic. The second one are the competence that incorporate skill, know-how, knowledge, as well as social and relational skill, which are required to perform the practice. And this is, in social terms, is related to the status of the subject. And the third one is the meaning, that incorporate issues that are considered relevant to respect of the material, understanding, belief, value, and norm, lifestyle, and emotion. And this is the cultural part of the dimension. And this, of course, we can refer material to the surface diversity or the visible diversity and the competence meaning on the deep diversity level. That is the best part. That's all. Thanks.
Thanks, Ivano, and thanks, George and Galileo, for the introduction. So while reflecting about diversity and its role in design research and practice, I decided to start from this inspiring picture from a park in Copenhagen. The park is called Superkilen, and it's a colorful jewel placed in the city's most culturally diverse neighborhood. You can stay on the first one. So what it is interesting about this place is the design process that has been built to engage with the citizens while envisioning what this park could become. So local residents were engaged by architects and designers to contribute cultural elements that recall the country of origin from different communities. And the result is a park where you can find Moroccan fountains that are close to Parisian street lamps and elements of Japanese playgrounds together with Italian benches, for instance. So Superkilen, for me, it's an excellent example of how to make public spaces appealing to everyone using purposeful design choices that enable users to experience the park in multiple ways. So there are playground structures for children, seating areas for small groups or individuals, sculptural elements for passers-by, and all this reflects the neighborhood diversity. So in this perspective, diversity means inclusion, and it is used also as an opportunity for a neighborhood to get to know the different communities that are part of it and that are represented, and even to recognize and declare its identity. So we can go to the next slide. If we move then into the realm of product and services, inclusive, so the concept of inclusion is of course a central one, and inclusive design is a very well-known approach, particularly when we are talking about digital products and services. Big firms like the one I'm referring to in these slides have been working on their inclusive design principles and frameworks to ensure that the full range of human diversity is taken into account in the design process. We know very well that often exclusion happens when we solve problems using our own biases. So designers need to develop methods and tools to get rid of those biases and create products and services that open up to more people and their diversity, and also reflect how people really are with respect to not only ability, but also language, culture, gender, age, and other forms of human difference. When we design inclusively, it does not mean that we design a solution that fits everyone, but rather we are designing a diversity of ways for everyone to participate in an experience with a sense of belonging. So we know that many people are unable to participate in aspects of society, both physical, think about public spaces and urban belonging, and also digital. And here we can think about the digitalization trend, for instance, in public services. So the designer's role is to understand why and how people are excluded, and to find actionable steps to take towards inclusive design. So if we move to the last slide, to conclude, when we talk about design and diversity, we are ultimately talking about social innovation or digital social innovation and democracy. So what I'm trying to say is that the role of the designer is not confined to the design of the interaction that should happen through a given artifact, but can entail the design of policies that will decide, for instance, the ways in which a public space will be inhabited, the ways in which a citizen will participate to the public debate. As stated in the quote of the slides, These are modes of design that negotiate, facilitate, advocate, even provoke and evoke insight and experiment with putting civic-led commons-based values into practice. And among these values, I think and I believe that diversity is a very crucial one. So, how to infrastructure participation processes that takes into account diversity, how to address the challenges that the digital divide, particularly with respect to data, poses to our democracies. I think that reflecting about diversity, these are just some of the questions that we should ask ourselves as designers. And then I'll pass to Paula, I think.
Yes. Hello, and thank you, George and Galileo, for the nice introduction. So diversity, is an important and fascinating concept, I think, as much has become clear by now. Recently, though, when observing diversity and studying discourses on diversity, I got increasingly concerned about development that I'm observing. And I think that adds very well on also how Daniel ended his, maybe how should we call it, pitch. And that is that diversity is increasingly being understood and also, and even more importantly, treated as a kind of resource when we look at how we talk about diversity, how we deal with it. And from an ethical perspective, I think that this is actually quite a dangerous development, because if we understand and treat diversity as a resource, then we open up avenues, and this implies that diversity can be commercialized and it can be commodified and thus being exploited. Now, some might ask, well, why is that even a problem at all? And I think if we look at, for example, the field of information and communication technologies, this might become a little bit clearer why this might be a problem. These technologies are certainly particularly well positioned to make profit of diversity. But as you probably all know, they are typically owned by just a tiny handful of people, not the masses. So it would be naive to assume that the commercialization of diversity on these kind of technologies would be to the benefit of everyone equally. And then I think we should ask ourselves, shouldn't we all benefit equally from our shared diversity, which by definition, as Ivano told us, we can't have on our own, but only together. And I think so. We should all benefit equally from diversity. And that is also why we, and I can speak for ethics in general here, as ethics is a very diverse field in itself, but I think I can speak for our ethics team at ECOD. That is why we really advocate for an understanding and treatment of diversity as a value rather than a resource, and to do so explicitly and proactively. And the following definition, next slide please, is inspired by the work of the political philosopher Young, and I think it speaks very well to this conviction. Diversity means radical difference among a variety of people in a plural society. Diversity is not something that enriches me or a means to achieve optimal usability of people or to increase the performance of institutions and organizations. Instead, diversity is about the question of how we can live together in a plural society in an inclusive, participatory, and non-discriminatory way. So in short, we understand diversity as a common good, and we value diversity as a way of living together. But we do not do so always and unconditionally. Sometimes diversity can be perceived as mere chaos. It can be exhausting. And like other normatively dependent values, such as tolerance, for example, diversity or the value of diversity indeed has its limits. And this can, for example, be the case when diversity includes people with undemocratic interest, or people who are in a powerful position and abuse this position to dominate or oppress others who are in a vulnerable one. In such cases, the value of diversity reaches its limits, and we have to do something about that. So we need to orchestrate diversity to prevent it from becoming a kind of noise in which the quieter sounds are drowned out by the clamor of the louder ones. Next one, please. Next slide. In a world where unfair power asymmetries are undeniably a social fact, and especially in a digitized world where these power asymmetries are even amplified by the unequal distribution of data power, diversity must be curated with great care and ethico-political imagination. And this act of curation, however, is a difficult task. And I won't deny that. We must beware of paternalism and ethnocentrism when engaging in it. Sometimes, for example, diversity needs to be restricted in order to protect it. And that might seem paradoxical. It might, but in fact, it is not paradoxical at all. Think about safe spaces, for example. That's a classic. And in times of hate speech, we need such spaces more than ever. And we shouldn't exclude those who need them from digital media. And at the same time, curating diversity must also include striving to minimize unfair exclusion. Think about affirmative actions for inclusion, for example. These are as much a part of curating diversity as are safe spaces. Both are equally important. And this really is the crux of the matter, because you sometimes can't have both. You need to make a choice, take a decision. And this can be very difficult. Therefore, balancing the need for inclusion and the need for protection is one of the greatest challenges when curating diversity. And maybe to sum up and to respond to George's question at the very beginning, why is it important to work on diversity today? Well, I think that focusing on our innovation and design efforts, our tech development ethics, on the careful creation of diversity as a value and as a common good, as a way of living together, can be a means of holding ourselves accountable for ethical progress in a digitalized world, which is shaped by historically rooted power asymmetries and made up of finite resources. And really this kind of distribution, this fair distribution of these resources, we all know that is one of the greatest challenges that we're facing. And I do think that carefully curating diversity can be a means of dealing with this challenge. And so much from my side of ethics for now. And I think I'm handing now over to George, who will moderate the discussion.
George, you are mute.
Thank you. Sorry about that. A helicopter went over and it wasn't the outbreak of the Third World War, but it was very noisy. Thank you, Paula. I have a couple of questions before I invite you, the audience, to come in with any questions that you might like to pose to the panel. Paula, would you be happier if we got rid of the idea of promoting diversity and just called it trying to eliminate discrimination, which is based on, age-old patterns of power, etc.?
No, not at all, because that's what I meant with this kind of balance between protection and inclusion. I mean, the one is avoiding harm and the other one is promoting something and handling, dealing with, as I said, how we want to live together and facing radical difference and in plurality, and just non-discriminative actions doesn't cover it all. It's the avoidance of harm, but it isn't proactive inclusion. I mean, for me, curating diversity is really, it's an activity, it's something that we do, and which is quite proactive and explicit. Yeah.
Thank you. So turning to my artificial intelligence colleagues, who seem to call themselves engineers, including Fausto, how can artificial intelligence, machine learning, contribute to this cultivation of support for diversity? What's the agenda for the engineers if they take on this idea of?
So George, I can perhaps just take a first go, and I'm sure Fausto will have, and I see other colleagues from the project also in the call. So for me, it is a long process, and if we start from the point of thinking as it was described by Paula, of diversity as a value at every element of the pipeline of analysis and whatever comes out of the analysis in a technological development, diversity as a value needs to be introduced, reflected upon for the design, for the testing, for the evaluation, for the correction, for the continuous revisiting of the assumptions. So for me, it's not a unique fix. It's rather the integration of these values into the design and the implementation of every element of the pipeline. To give one example, the project has been able to collect data from student volunteers from multiple countries, right? And this is in itself an achievement thanks to the voluntary contribution of the students who participated. But we actually need to start by actually checking whether any built-in biases are already there by the participants who decided to contribute versus the ones who didn't, by examining whether any machine learning done on that data would already have biases built in. And that requires a careful process of understanding how the data is produced and understanding also the different sources of error, both technical, but also human from the perspective of what assumptions we make on the data as we process it. And this is a tiny step in that larger pipeline that I just described. But I think it's important to think about it as a series of interventions, essentially, on how we are conceiving the pipelines for data generation, data production, data analysis, and consumption. Perhaps other colleagues would like to add to this.
Thank you, Daniel. Fausto, are you around still? Any comment? Maybe he's turned his machine off.
Yeah, if I may add something here.
Okay.
Also, in terms of the interactions, I think the fact that the software is embedded with certain knowledge of these values, of the understanding of diversity, may help in adapting the interaction between individuals to the diversity needs of the different tasks. So I think it is very important that diversity becomes one of the design elements in software, so that when the software mediates interactions with humans or between humans, diversity is taken into account. So it should become an element in the design of systems. And I think this is a matter of education also of the engineers that design these the architectures of AI systems. So it's data, but it's also the knowledge and the interactions between people.
Thank you, Carlos. I should say that Carlos is one of the WeNet specialist engineers developing the machine learning approaches. Well, I think at that stage, I should open it up to you, the audience, and I'm hoping that the chat function is going to work if you'd like to pose a question. Galileo, have I got that right?
Yes, that's correct. There is no question present on the chat, but I've got it open, and if anybody from the audience would like to pose a question, please feel free. That's the time. Otherwise, we can also touch upon this maybe later on, but it's the right time if you would like to.
So I should say, everyone, we ran a pilot study in the spring of this year. And one of the things that our colleagues were looking at was incentive. So if people asked a lot of questions, they got a badge. And if they answered a lot of questions, they got a pat on the back with a badge. Maybe I should have brought that in for this session. So if you ask a question, I'll give you a metaphorical pat on the back.
Oh, we should use the chatbot.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, I'm going back to Daniel and his statistics about the number of women who are taking degrees in computer science, etc., etc. If one were a Bayesian, and Bayes statistics is based on, you have prior probabilities and you change those probabilities when evidence comes in. But if you were in that situation, there was a man and a woman, and your computer had gone down the drain, and you needed some help, a Bayesian statistician would say choosing the man would be probably, on probabilistic terms, the most sensible choice. I mean, if 90% of all computer engineers are male and 10% are female, then you've got a 9 to 1 chance, 10 to 1 chance that you'd make the right decision. So I guess we go back to this thing. How do we use design? How do these machine learning algorithms avoid just replicating normality, replicating current conditions, and doing so in black boxes, which the machinations of which we really don't understand terribly well?
I guess, George, that brings us back whether the best we can do is just to reproduce the status quo, or whether we actually want to go beyond that. Yep. And I would like to believe we can change the status quo, and therefore perhaps it's good not to go Bayesian, and perhaps it's better just to start from what world we want to live in, and therefore what values we want to insert in the systems that we will create.
Yes. Yeah. Carlos? You're muted.
I mean, sorry, yeah. I was going to say something in similar, in the sense that we need to define what is the society we want and then plan to get there. And that's not necessarily Bayesian. I mean, we need to change things, and sometimes we will need to go beyond the current status quo. So I fully agree with Daniel that the objective is to have very clear what are the values that our society want to uphold, and then design the system so that we reach those goals through technology, as far as technology can help. So I fully agree with Daniel on this. Yeah.
We also discussed quite intensively, like, how can we deal with this issue that we are a European project with mostly, I mean, or at the core team, people from Europe, but we want to design a technology that would be applied all over the world. And then do we want to project our values, which I assume like are more or less European values, our shared values, on other people, other parts of the world? And we had some discussions about that. But on one hand, we say that we don't want people to get hurt. I mean, that's an universal. But we also don't want people to adopt our European values, because we want to, like, that would be paradoxical to the idea of curating diversity. So I think this is really one of the greatest challenges in this regard in this project.
Yes, Paula, I fully agree. In this project, actually, when I was saying we, I was meaning communities. So each community should somehow be able to define what are the values that they want to uphold, and have a say in how the technology is shaped and adapted to that society, to that particular community. The question is that technology cannot go against the values of the society that is using it, and that has to be part of the engineering process, as I said before. I mean, it should be part of the requirements. And the culture where the technology is going to be embedded has to have a say. Of course, not Eurocentric. It has to be on each one of the communities, as we are seeing in the different examples in the project.
Okay, now I see in the chat, Renata Baumgartner has asked a question. Can everyone see that question, or is that available only to me? Well, I'll read it out.
You can all see it, yeah.
You can see it.
Yeah, it's available to everybody, but yeah, it's a great help if you can just read it aloud so that.
Okay, there is different ways how to design inclusive technologies for the old technologies, e.g. participatory design. However, it seems to be more challenging to tackle that for black boxes, such as AI machine learning. What do you suggest here? How can inclusive methods be adapted to account for that?
Yes.
Carlos. Oh, sorry, Amalia, please.
It's fine. I can give it a start and then Carlos can continue on that. So I think, so the problem is that there shouldn't be black boxes, right? So there should be transparency when we are, even when it is about artificial intelligence and machine learning. So what are the logics behind the algorithms that are used in the different applications should be accessible for the users. It should be clear, as well as the data that we are sharing and how the data is used. And I wouldn't say that then participatory design is too old for that. It's definitely more tricky, let's say, to apply those methods and principles in this context, but it's definitely possible, I would say. So Carlos.
Yeah. What I would say is similar to what you said. I mean, one of the requirements for technology is that it should be explainable, especially when we are dealing with what the European Parliament identifies as high-risk applications. So the users of those applications need to have a justification of the decisions that are made. So black boxes may not be acceptable as an engineering method for high-risk applications. So we need to put that as a requirement. I mean, the explainability of systems. There is research being done on that. It's a difficult issue for some machine learning techniques, but we have to promote transparency and explainability.
Thank you, Carlos. I see another question from Celine Gressel. Related to what you've just been saying, Paula, can you tell us more about the methods for integrating people's positions to avoid simply imposing our values of diversity on them?
Yeah, so I mean, when we were facing with how should we deal with that, we were strictly like trying to follow the path of promoting user agency, which means giving them more choices. But then again, we have this problem that sometimes you overload people when you ask them, is this, how many people do you want to ask? Like, whom do you want to ask? Is this or this kind of question? Is it sensitive? Then people might also just get annoyed and stop using the tool. So there's also this aspect of usability, which is certainly an argument. And then Laura and Kobe and Avi, other people in the project, they have done fascinating study. They're not finished yet on transparency. How much transparency do users actually want? And maybe for some it's as far as I remember, also opinions drifted very far, like from each other. Some said that they laugh, for example, when they're being pushed, when they are being led through that chatbot, and others said that it's actually very annoying. But I think also that Laura's here, or George, you had these very varying responses in your questionnaires or in your exit surveys.
Yeah, I was going to ask Laura, who is a colleague of Paula's at the Center for Ethics in Science Technology. Laura, do you have any comment to make on that? Oh, there you are, on that question.
Yes, thank you very much, Paula. And on transparency, I can just second everything that has been said. It's so important to make users not just understand the system that they interact with, but furthermore have some control over it. So they have to have some kind of option to engage it, to choose what kind of recommendations the users get, what kind of data protection privacy rules they can apply. So this is absolutely crucial. And I think what has also, what is kind of also the topic of this workshop is value sensitive design. And this is something we have also engaged with in great detail in the WeNet project, trying to be sensitive to different values. And I think Batya Friedman will speak more to that in a moment.
Yeah, absolutely. So are there any other questions?
Well, if I may add one single thing for this last question by Celine, you're asking about methods. So I think we are promoting that the technology should be value aware. So the technology has to be aware of the values of the community. And sometimes those values have to be implemented in the form of norms that basically shape the way the software interacts with people. Now, how our values translated into a norm can be interpreted in different ways by different people. So the methods there could be basically agreement technologies, so negotiation between people, decision of a group of what are the norms to be adopted, even voting or the social choice applied to the norms of the group. So that would be the way in which you could somehow put groups of people in control of the software. So, sorry, George, that's it.
No, thank you, please. So any other questions? Because if there aren't any questions, what I think I would do is to invite Paula to introduce a very distinguished guest speaker from the United States. Over to you, Paula.
Yes, Batya, welcome. It's an honor and also a pleasure to have you. And maybe just one note, Batya is currently, I think you're at that moment right now, somewhere around Seattle.
Yes, I'm in Seattle.
In Seattle. So it's very early in the morning for you, and I think that's worth a special thanks that you made it despite these, working, so to say, off hours. So I think many of us here probably know you and your work already, but it's a multidisciplinary workshop, so you never know, and I will introduce you. Batya is a professor at the University of Washington, the Information School, focusing on human-centered computing, computer-human interaction, and information and society. And she co-directs the Value Sensitive Design Lab with David Henry together, and the Tech Policy Lab with Wang Carlo, both at the University of Washington. And probably Batya is best known for her groundbreaking work in the field of value-sensitive design. Over the last 30 years, she has continuously refined and expanded this methodology, which is now known and actually, I think, applied all around the world. So she's truly a pioneer, you could say, and she has done extremely important work also in terms of bridging ethics and technology. And for this, in 2012, Batya has been awarded the SIGCHI Social Impact Award. So Daniel, you just mentioned that there are a few women who got major prizes. Batya got one. Some of her earlier work has proven groundbreaking and is still, and I would just pick two of them out because I think that's really remarkable. One of these are, I mean, I think many of you know it, value-sensitive design and information systems, co-authored with Peter Kahn, Ellen Borning, and Aline Haldron. And then there's also that work on bias in computer systems, which she wrote together with Helen Nissenbaum already back in 1996. And I think that is actually quite like, in some ways, it's a visionary work given the relevance that this topic has today. More recently, Batya has published a book on value-sensitive design together with David Hamry at MIT Press. And this book is really comprehensive and very helpful. For me, it has become like really a faithful companion in the last 2 years. And so, yeah, thank you, Batya, for all your important work so far and for talking with us today and giving us a little glimpse into it.
Well, thank you so much, Paula, for inviting me. And let me just check that everybody can hear me easily. Is that okay? Great. So thank you so much. What I'd like to do, I've really enjoyed the conversation we've had, and I hope that what I'm going to present in just a brief amount of time is helpful, and I'll try to leave some time for conversation. But value-sensitive design is a practice, so I thought it would be nice if we did a little bit of practice together. So there'll be a design activity. So if you could just get some scratch paper and a pencil handy. And then the other thing that I would like, if you're in a place where it's possible for you to put your video on so that we can all see each other's faces, please go ahead and do that as well. And I'm going to share some slides to begin with. And then at a certain point, I'll be turning the slides off so we can see each other and interact, and then I'll be going back to the slides. So that's our game plan. So let me do that now while you are finding paper and pencil. So great, I think everyone should be able to see the slides, and I hope we'll be interacting for about 20 minutes or so through the talk, and then I'll open things up for your questions and conversation. And of course, I need to mention that the work that I'm going to present on and talk about, I've not done by myself, but with many, many other long-term collaborators over decades. I want to start by talking about moral imagination and technical imagination and the importance of bringing those two together in the work that we do when we build systems. So this is the book on value-sensitive design that Paula mentioned, and I'm going to start by just reading to you from the very beginning of the book. So in the introduction, the book actually begins with a quote for Rabindranath Tagore from 1922. And Tagore writes, the water vessel, taken as a vessel only, raises the question, why does it exist at all? Through its fitness of construction, it offers the apology for its existence. But where it is a work of beauty, it has no question to answer. It has nothing to do but to be. And then Dave and I write, in these few words, Rabindranath Tagore gently points us to the human condition. We learn from Tagore that being with our tools gives consideration not only to functionality, but also to human flourishing. And that is what I think your project is about when you talk about supporting diversity and connection among people. Thus, retelling Tagore's story of the water vessel, we might say, every human being is entitled to clean water to drink and a vessel from which to drink that water, that in some ways is our engineering call. And that vessel should be beautiful. And that is the call to human flourishing and to the respect for all of the aspects of what it means to be a human being on this planet. So when we talk about moral imagination and technical imagination, we're talking about doing that kind of work together in a really close, integrated manner. In the work that we do on value-sensitive design, critical to any kind of work that involves human beings, human values, and even non-human entities on the planet are considering the stakeholders. In value-sensitive design, we take a very broad view of stakeholders. Any entity that is affected by the technology. And we look at both what we call direct stakeholders, those who actually touch the technology. So those might be the people who are interacting with your systems. But we also look at indirect stakeholders, those who may not interact directly with your technology, but might be affected by it. So for example, in the system that you're building, as I understand it, where you're thinking primarily about linking university students, the other students in a dorm room with somebody who's meeting somebody through your system might be an indirect stakeholder, but so might their parents or other people in their community. If we are thinking, for example, in certain kinds of societies, like think about Afghanistan right now, where women's actions are often controlled by their male relatives, then a woman in Afghanistan using your system, indirect stakeholders who are critical will be the male relatives of that person. So value-sensitive design systematically surfaces direct and indirect stakeholders and bring them into the design process. In doing our work, we have found that a tripartite methodology is essential. When thinking about human values and technical design, there's a certain amount of work that we can do armchairing. We call those the conceptual investigations. You know, what can we think about? Who can we surface as stakeholders? What kinds of values do we think are relevant? For those values, we may often go to the philosophical literature to help ground those. So for example, when Helen and I did the work back in the 90s on bias in information systems, we went to the philosophical literature to understand that bias occurs when you have an unfair outcome that is systematic and causes harm. And that's really essential for understanding and separating out bias from just difference. And there's only so far that you can go conceptually. At some point, you need to go to the populations who are going to be affected and there do empirical work and bring all of the machinery you have from the social sciences to bear as is useful to you. And the work and tools, certainly from participatory design, has been mentioned, are really great tools there. And value-sensitive design adds yet another layer of methods, maybe close to 20 or more now to that. And all of those are relevant as appropriate. And as designers, we need to make good choices about method and how it is that we move from one method to another in the design process. Ultimately, we're, as engineers, interested in building tools and technologies, whether they be very simple tools like knots on a string for counting, or high-end digital tools like brain-machine interfaces or some of the AI systems that you're talking about. We may think that we've built those tools that are responsive to the values we identified conceptually and that we learned from the empirical investigations with stakeholders, but ultimately we need to take our technical work back to those communities to see if they actually experience our technical designs in the way in which we intended. And out of that, we may see feedback that tells us to do additional technical work, or maybe there's an additional value that arises from that, and we need to do further conceptual work. And so you can see how this is an iterative process and an integrative process. And that's really essential to doing this work in a deep and meaningful way. Okay, so the design activity. This is where you need your pencil and paper. And what I'm going to do is introduce you to a particular design case, and then I'm going to allow you to interact with one of the design methods from value-sensitive design, and we'll have a chance to share some of your experience. So here's our design prompt. This is a technology called Sleeve. Sleeve is a hypothetical embodied technology which uses a brain-computer interface to detect the wearer's affective states. So imagine that I have something, at the base of my neck, and you can plug into that, and it will tap into whatever my affective emotional states are. And then it's going to take those signals and use them to display those affects through an e-textile garment. So, let's say if I'm feeling angry, my sweater here gets a much brighter, hotter red. If I'm feeling very calm, maybe it turns a sort of softer, muted color. The fabric can change colors, texture, and shape according to the feelings of the wearer. Sleeves can be worn by people, such as those with autism, to help make their emotions more accessible to the people around them. So this is the technology that we're going to be working with for this design activity. And I hope it's clear to everyone. And the tool we're going to use are something called the envisioning cards. These were first published in 2011. They encapsulate knowledge that we developed over a 20-year period, and then we've since expanded them to multi-lifespan cards as well. Each of the cards has a provocative image. This one shows this parachute with the sky shining through in a dome, and a title on that side. This one is Perceptions of a Value. The cards are in one of 4 suits, so either about stakeholders, about time, about values, which this card is, and about pervasiveness, so widespread pervasive uptake. In addition to its title, every card has a theme, so it tells you what the general idea is. And then in bold next to that, it has a very specific design action that you can take. And so we're going to use a couple of these cards, but we're going to apply them to our design prompt. So again, remember that our design prompt is sleeve. So it's this brain machine interface that I've got here that taps into my affective state and then displays it onto my, my garment. Okay. So the first card that we're going to use is consider children. So what I'd like you to do now with your paper and pencil is think about sleeve and now consider it in relation to children. The general idea here is that children often appropriate systems that were originally designed for adults. So how might this system, sleeve, influence a child's social and moral development? And in order to do that, I'd like you to either, you can just consider children in light of this prompt and jot down some ideas, or if you want, you can go ahead and do the very specific prompt and think about a scenario. What would happen if a 7-year-old was interacting with this system? I'm gonna, I have a sand timer here, a 3-minute sand timer. I'm gonna flip it over and you have 3 minutes. So let me just check, are there any questions? If so, please put them in the chat, and Galileo, if you could let me know if there's a question, that would be great. And if there are no questions, then I'm gonna go ahead and flip the timer and you can go. Okay, 3 minutes. Okay, I see our sand timer is just about to run out of sand. So if you can finish crossing that last T, dotting that last I, that would be great. All right. And now I'd like you to do the same activity, but with a different envisioning card. So again, we're working with sleeve. And this time the card we're going to use is called Accounting for Culture. Has to do with pervasive uptake rather than stakeholders. And it says breakdowns can develop when people from one culture make assumptions about the conventions, norms, or practices of other cultures. How might your system be misunderstood by users who are unfamiliar with your culture? So imagine that sleeve has been designed and appropriated within your culture, but now it is moved to another culture, and what might be some of the collisions that occur. So again, I'm going to flip the timer and you'll have 3 minutes. Okay, so go. Okay, so our sand timer is again just about run out. So if you could finish just again dotting that I, crossing that T, that would be great. And now what I'm going to do is stop sharing my screen for a moment so that we can all see each other. And if you had something interesting occurred to you with one or the other of the cards that you'd like to share with the rest of us, go ahead and raise your hand, you know, using the chat to raise your hand. And I'm going to ask Galileo, if you wouldn't mind helping me just to call on the first person who raises their hand, and then you'll have an opportunity to share with us. So definitely. If you have something interesting that happened, yeah, great. Let's see. So I'm not sure I can see all of that. So Galileo, I'm deferring to you to let me know and call on the first person. Please go ahead. I see George has raised his hand, a real hand. So George, why don't you go first? Tell us, if you would, tell us which card you used and then just one thing that was interesting.
George, you're muted.
I was thinking about cultural differences, and I can't remember the paper, but it was one of my colleagues did some work with doctors, and they compared people from the East with people from the West, and how they described symptoms. And apparently, I forget the technical terms used, but people in the West and East have completely different ways of expressing emotions around physical disabilities. So so cultural differences, I thought, were a key issue.
Yeah, thank you. And it's kind of funny sitting here in the United States, when I hear East and West, I think of East and West Coast of the US, but I'm sure that you had a different East and West in mind.
I certainly did.
That's great. Okay, is there someone else who used one of the cards but came up with a different, something different that occurred to them? Just go ahead and raise your hand like this if your video is on, or raise the hand in chat. And then Galileo again, if you'll just call on someone.
Yeah, I see a hand from Wolflo, and you can open the mic if you would like to.
Yeah,
Please.
great. And please tell us which card you used and yeah, what your idea was.
Yeah, so I was thinking about the children, and then this is not, I mean, so this is not particular to like children, but more like children development. I was wondering whether this would change maybe, or this would maybe, you know, sort of lead to a sort of synesthesia that we associate like colors with emotions more readily. I mean, so like real synesthesia is something neurologically, but like, you know, a cultural, you know, learned kind of synesthesia, and then how our society would have to change, for example, if, you know, all our color coding is gone, you know, totally different, in a different direction, that, you know, like traffic lights or the red, yellow, green kind of thing suddenly doesn't match anymore, and all these kind of things.
Yeah, great. Thank you for that. Let's hear another one or two more. So is there someone else who raised their hand and has something different than the two observations we've had so far?
I see Carlos is ready to ask a question, please.
Yeah, so maybe I misunderstood what I had to do, but I thought that sleeves was a very interesting interface that could be useful for adaptive learning. You mentioned in one of the cards to improve learning. And
did you, which card are you talking about? Consider children or
children
culture?
on the first one, about improving
Great.
learning.
Mm-hmm.
So in adaptive learning, it is very important, and many people are studying the emotional state of kids in order to engage them by changing the task they are doing. And so I think it will be very simple using the computer camera just to detect the color of the clothes, of the fabric of the kid, to adapt the task that the kid is doing. When they are bored or they are sad, I mean, kind of change the activity to improve their engagement. I think that would be very easy and very helpful for adaptive learning.
Great, thank you. And perhaps, could we hear one more from culture? So if something interesting occurred to you when you were using the culture card, go ahead and raise your hand and share with us.
We have Renate Baumgartner that wants to ask a question, so please.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I thought about both scenarios, and for the when I consider culture, I wondered if maybe in some cultures it would be thought as being rude or invasive to show affect so in your face. So that was one thing. And like very generally, it was much easier for me to think about negative consequences than of positive ones. So.
So interesting that your colleague who just went ahead before you spoke before had a very positive potential use from the same technology. Yeah. And I think that you're right. And some cultures are very effusive about emotion. People are very expressive, and others are much more subdued in their emotion. So how would that cultural expression of emotion be handled is really a great point. Okay, well, I am certain that there were many more other interesting ideas that arose as a group. But what I want to point out is that 10 minutes ago, you hadn't seen the sleeve technology before. You probably hadn't thought about it before. And then in just a very short period of time, using a toolkit like the envisioning cards, you were able to surface some really, I would say, effects of depth to get beyond the surface of what some of the implications might be. And if we pulled all of the things that everyone was thinking about, there'd probably be some initially fairly rich characterizations of both some positive effects, some unanticipated effects, potentially some negative effects. And that would begin to give you a handle on how to get started exploring this technology. And again, you spent just 3 minutes, each person, just 3 minutes with each card. So a very small investment of time, but with a targeted tool to help you begin that exploration. Okay, I'm going to go back to sharing my screen for just a minute, not too long here. So what I've done next is I thought a little bit, Paula and I had a chance to talk in preparation for my speaking with you all. And, you know, one of the questions she left me thinking about that may or may not be, you know, relevant to you. I think as a group, perhaps this is already clear to you, but what's a technical decision got to do with it? I mean, clearly there are times when you are thinking about cultural issues, but as an engineer, when you're just making, you know, just a basic technical decision, what does that have to do with values and with some of the cultural implications and implications for diversity? And so thinking within the WeNet context, I just wanted to share 2 examples with you that maybe will be interesting for you and maybe are also things that you've already thought about. So here's the first example. I was imagining, you know, university students facilitating communication. Maybe there's some kind of tweet-like channel that you're thinking about. And then as an engineer, you have to make a decision, like what's the character length going to be? Is it 140 characters, 180 characters, 240 characters? You know, and what does this have to do with any kind of diversity or culture? So maybe just think about that for a minute. What, if anything, does this have to do, this technical decision about how much space you're going to set aside in memory for every one of these tweets? And then what I'd like to do is just share with you this observation of, well, what language are we communicating in? Are people communicating in English, or are they communicating in a language like Kinyarwanda? You can see even from the way in which English is written and how much space it takes on my slide versus Kinyarwanda, from my experience working in Rwanda and with Kinyarwanda speakers for nearly a decade, Kinyarwanda speech and language is about 1.5 times longer in both written text and speech time than something one might say in English. So if we have a character length for a tweet, whether it's 140 characters or 180 characters, and we think about communicative capability. We actually see that English, because it has fewer letters for expressing something, actually has a greater expressive space potentially than a language like Kinyarwanda that just has longer words and a grammar that takes a greater amount of space to say something. So this is an example of, you know, if WeNet is about communication and about relationship, and you can see how a very specific technical decision you could just view as an arbitrary technical decision might, when situated, given the way in which language works, which is so fundamental to human beings and human communication, might be experienced really quite differently by different kinds of language speakers. So just one example. The second example that I thought I would occurred to me again when I was thinking about university students and WeNet and the idea of bringing people together is, well, likely there's going to be some kind of scheduler for some kind of virtual meetings, or maybe meeting in person, but some kind of meeting and some way of scheduling those. And again, as the engineers, you're setting up some kind of tool for facilitating the meetings. You know, something about time needs to be decided. You know, what are the units? When will it start? Duration? Something like that. And that seems, again, a sort of an arbitrary technical kind of decision, but in this schedule, somewhere in there, you need to say, you know, when are we going to meet? And again, I started thinking about, well, time. There are so many dimensions and ways of thinking about time. So, you know, for example, there is absolute time, and then there's also situational time. Absolute time is, for example, how I was told about this week that it would be, my talk would begin at 9:10 a.m. in Seattle. And I was also told what the time would be in Europe. So I had two absolute times in two different time zones. But there's also situational time. And so if I was Muslim, I might say, I want to meet you after evening prayer. And that's a very specific time and very well understood among Muslims about when to meet. But for somebody who's not Muslim, being told to meet after evening prayer, somebody might not know what that time was about. And you can see that when you make a choice, an engineering choice, a technical choice about the representation of time, embedded in that is a tremendous amount of cultural commitment and a sense of who, you know, we brought up earlier in the conversation, the notion of belonging. Who belongs within this universe, this virtual universe that you are building? And am I able to belong in the way in which, and act in the way in which I live in my life from a temporal point of view? So I hope that these two examples are helpful for you for thinking about how just very simple kinds of engineering decisions actually can embed very deep cultural knowledge and change somebody's experience about whether or not they belong. Are they an outsider who's being allowed in to look in, or is this really a technical system, a way of being that really is inclusive of and bringing them in the way in which they are experiencing and living in the world? So with that, I'd like to just conclude quickly with some practical takeaways from value-sensitive design, and realize that, of course, I've not really given you much of a robust introduction to value-sensitive design, but let me just say that there are methods. There are many, many, many methods, and encourage you to find out about them and to use them, and use them frequently throughout the development of WeNet and your design and engineering processes. I also like to encourage you to think about using human values as a criteria for evaluating system performance. So alongside of other criteria like reliability, you want your system to be reliable. But I think you could also ask, you know, take the value of dignity. And in evaluating your system and its system performance, ask, are all of the stakeholders in the system, do they experience the system as one that respects their dignity? I think I heard also questions of agency. That might also be another important value, and can be used for evaluating the system in the same way in which you can say, well, this system isn't ready to be released yet. We need to go back and rethink something. Another strategy that we use in value-sensitive design is both to co-evolve the technology and the social structure of the policy. And that may also be useful or helpful to you as you think about WeNet. I'd also encourage you to think long-term and at scale. And I think you are already beginning in this direction because you are thinking about many, many different places on the globe. There could be even more. And, you know, if you're successful, this may be around for a long time. You know, if you think about email, essentially the email that I'm using right now is the same email that I was using 30 or 40 years ago. So when we do design something and it catches on, it can be there for a long time. So consider that in your designs. And also, in our moment in history, I really think we have to think about the planet. Our planet is finite yet regenerative, and we need to engineer within this constraint. You know, it's not clear to me that 24/7 connectivity is sustainable, and certainly not for the population on the planet now and the population that may be on the planet in another decade or 2 decades. So how is something like WeNet something that can mesh with what might be sustainable on the planet? And finally, I would like to say, have the courage not to build, but just say no. If there are aspects of the system that you're building where you recognize it might put certain groups at risk, say physical harm, or it might lead them to be surveilled by others. I think of victims from domestic violence. I think of universities. We have people starting relationships who may be breaking up. Those relationships, how do people protect themselves there? We have very different cultures that have different ways of exerting control. And so there may be certain things that you decide not to build because a person's physical or mental or emotional safety is at stake. And again, I think this goes back to the notion of balance and that curation. I was intrigued by that phrase, curating diversity. But what are the other values in addition to diversity that are essential for a system like this? Surely safety is one. And those values exist in tension and a delicate balance with each other. And so paying attention to that balance is really important. And sometimes the better part of valor is not to enable certain kinds of things within a system in order to strike a reasonable balance there. Finally, I'd like to say that in doing work in value-sensitive design, we focus on progress, not perfection. I think the words like the best system, the right system, I think those words actually work against us. I think the hope is that we can build a good system, that we can do better, that we can mitigate some of the problems. And then from whatever it is that we build, it's an iterative and integrative process of then seeking to improve from that. So keeping an eye on progress, but not requiring perfection, I think is a really helpful strategy for doing this kind of work. And with that, I will thank you so much. Thank you so much for inviting me here and sharing your project and being able to listen in on your conversation. And I would just welcome any questions or comments that you would like to make. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now so we can all see each other and have a bit of conversation in the time that's available. And again, I'll invite you to put your questions or comments into the chat or wave your hand, and I will let Galileo be our moderator of any questions or comments. And again, I'll invite you to share your video on the screen so that we can, if you're in a place where you can, so that we can all see each other. I think that helps to have a more engaged conversation. All right, thank you.
Thank you very much, Batya. Yeah, if anybody has a question, I will have a look at it and read them aloud so that that everybody catches them.
Can we also just, do we need to write in the chat? No, we can also just ask.
Sure. Yes.
That's true. We can also do with the raised hands if it's easier. Yeah, we can also do that. It's probably quicker.
Yeah. So I was still thinking about this Twitter example, and then like what we discussed and what you brought up again, and well, probably the idea is that if everybody has 100 characters, it's fair. And you just made clear that it's not fair because it doesn't take into account that people are in different positions and in different needs. So, and this reminded me so much at this general conversation about fairness measures and whether fairness is enough to achieve justice, which I think this example that it is probably not. So yeah, so I was wondering still, I mean, human values, well, but again, how can we I mean, human values could be so many different things to so many different people. It's not so easy to just say we orient ourselves at human values. So how can we decide what they are and for whom? And
well, so again, I think progress, not perfection, right? We need to start somewhere, and we need to use the tools that we have to begin to make progress. So I think if we frame the question, we can frame the question in a way such that we're paralyzed. It just seems too big and too hard, and so we don't know what to do, and so we do nothing. And that, I think, is what we want to avoid. And so what our tools, by tools I mean value-sensitive design tools and methods, do is they help us gain purchase in some initial ways where we can make progress. We can make some better decisions. We can be aware of the fact that a fixed character length that doesn't account for language is not going to give the same communicative opportunity to different kinds of speakers. And then we can begin to think intentionally about what we might want to do about that, or if we can do something about that, or if we have good ideas about something like that. Maybe we don't have any good ideas, in which case we're aware of that limitation. And then maybe we make a decision somehow to think, well, English has become such a dominant language across the globe. Maybe we want to try to privilege other languages that are not like English. We might take a strategy like that. Or we might want to do something to make that visible so that speakers are aware. Maybe we need to manage it by letting speakers know that there will be this difference. So these are just, I'm just riffing at ways in which one might poke towards a kind of design move that one might make. But these all come first from recognizing that what seems like an innocuous technical decision actually, when situated, isn't creating, isn't fair in the way in which one might have thought it was fair, right? And that's the beginning of the work. So this is hard work, you know, it takes time. It takes working with lots of different stakeholders. You don't get everything, you know, right, but the question is, can you do better than if you had not? The claim is that by doing and engaging in the work in this way, one will arrive at a better solution than if one had done nothing.
Thank you. I think we can maybe take another question. I see Laura was the first in this round. Please go ahead.
Thanks, Galileo. Thank you, Batya, for your presentation. It was really interesting. And I was wondering how value-sensitive design relates to participatory design, because in the exercise right now, we were putting ourselves in the shoes of stakeholders like children, for example, and kind of thinking, what is their position, what is their needs, their preferences. And another method, of course, would be to ask them and to involve them. But again, and this is something we're facing in WeNet as well, we cannot engage every single stakeholder. So do you have any recommendations on how to balance that? And is it legitimate to sometimes make a decision for a stakeholder, although the person or the group is not actively involved?
Right. So I guess there's several things to say. First of all, value-sensitive design was, when I first started working on it, I was looking strongly to participatory design. This is, back in the late 80s, early 90s. One of the challenges with participatory design, I was very drawn to it, but it was developed within industry, within the Scandinavian context, where there were co-determination laws, and that have strongly influenced the shape of participatory design. And I was trying to think about what could I do in the US context when we're designing things like browsers that are going to reach across the globe. So there are very strong and very positive linkages between value-sensitive design and participatory design. Then in answer to your question, recall in the diagram I showed that there are conceptual investigations, empirical investigations, and technical investigations. Value-sensitive design says we have to do them all. We are talking about, and because our time together was so short, I took away some of the slides I usually have about our tools. Tools are part of the human condition, our tools and technologies, and our tools shape our way of being in the world. And then by virtue of being in the world, we then invent new tools. So there's this very deeply interactional way in which our tools are part of what it means to be human. And in turn, they shape the way in which we experience ourselves as human beings. So when you hold to that, that's why you see that the tripartite methodology is essential. You can't take away one piece of that and think that you can do your design work well. The envisioning cards are a toolkit for, well, they can be used in many, many ways. They're a bit like a pencil. So when you as the designer use the envisioning cards yourself to think through a design context, as we were doing, then you were doing a conceptual investigation. But similarly, for example, in work with homeless young people within the United States, it's a challenge we have in the US. Other countries don't necessarily have the same challenge. We were trying to understand ways in which they felt safe or unsafe, and ways in which mobile phones might be designed to help them feel safer. And in doing that design work with them, as they made their designs, we then gave them envisioning cards and had them use the card to help prompt them to think through their designs and surface other kinds of aspects that they might want to talk about. So that's the same tool that's being used, but being used by stakeholders directly in an empirical investigation. So I think that the challenge as designers, we all work with limited resources, limited time, is to choose well, to do what you can do conceptually or by yourself as the designer, but at a certain point, you need to take that back to the stakeholders. And once you've designed a technology, you need to bring that back to the stakeholders to ensure that they experience what you have designed with the very best of your intentions, somewhat similarly to the way in which you had intended and the way in which, from your prior work with them, you think would make sense. And often what happens is through interacting with something, other things in the environment and the conditions surface, and people become aware of things that they hadn't thought about that are essential. In value-sensitive design, when we talk about values, we talk about what's important to people in their lives. with an ethical and moral emphasis. And so when people bring things forward that are really important, like I hadn't realized that because I'll be doing this in my home, actually my other family members are implicated and they feel really uncomfortable about X. I have, someone in my household who's very ill and they feel very, very uncomfortable in the fact that their illness is exposed through this technology that was supposed to help me as a university student talk with another university student. If you're asking them questions, about just being university students, that's not going to surface. But then you'll see that might be the thing that has them shut down the system and not participate. So these empirical pieces are really an essential part. Yeah. I see a couple other hands, I think. Let's see, Daniel, did you have a question or comment, please?
Please, yes.
Thank you. I just wanted to comment on the point you made about the importance of using values as part of the system evaluation. Also connecting it to a previous comment where the emphasis was on, and still is, I think, this trade-off or belief trade-off between performance and transparency or explainability in black box AI. And clearly from the purely technical side, there's this overemphasis on system performance as in accuracy or any of the other standard measures, which only serves to compare the boxes against other boxes. But as soon as you put them and let them operate in real life, those accuracy measures might be completely irrelevant because they are now subject to many other values about where they are implemented and how, and used by whom and for what purposes. So I just wanted to make this connection. I found that really, really important for our project, and to embed that practice within the way in which we think about the platform and the future of it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And let me just share two other points relevant to your comment. I believe there has been work done with the disabilities community, this kind of example, let's say somebody has a physical disability, it makes them hard for them to use a printer. And I think they have done studies that show that if somebody could be supported so that they have like 100% success using the printer, but it exposes them in ways they're uncomfortable, versus 70% of the time they can use the printer successfully, but their dignity is preserved and their agency is preserved, that people with a disability prefer the system that has lower performance, but actually retains their dignity and their agency. And I think that's really important because engineering culture is, as you were pointing out, foregrounds the performance, but doesn't take the value considerations and experience into account. So that's one example. And then I also wanted to point out, in our work, we use the term autonomy to talk about the ability to realize your own goals and intentions. And I find that more helpful than talking about control. So for example, when I'm using my computer right now to communicate with you, realizing my goals and intentions is facilitating our communication. And I really do not want control over the lower levels of my machine that's enabling all of that, right? So I think thinking about what are people's goals and intentions, and what is it that they need to understand in order to be able to make good decisions for themselves in that regard. And then how do you provide them with that understanding? And that shifts the question. I think the conversation around transparency needs to be far more nuanced and in the service of autonomy, because the vast amount of things that are going on, I don't want to know anything about, right? And in fact, if I had all of that transparency, I would be overwhelmed with the amount of information. I'd be spending all of my time trying to see how everything is working And I would never get to realize my own goals and intentions because those are really secondary to them. We encountered that also with cookies and informed consent online, I think, as a, and that's work that we did back in the early 2000s about what does it mean to have informed consent around cookies? What do people really want to know and how? But people don't want to be informed about each cookie and having to make a determination, do I accept it or not accept it? They don't want that kind of transparency because that task is really a distraction from what it is that they really want to be doing. So I think the lessons that we learned there, those design lessons, can be directly applicable to the kinds of questions you're asking now around transparency. Great. So I don't know, I noticed it's a little bit past 10 and it's a little bit past 10 for me. So it's 3 minutes past the hour wherever you are. And I'm not sure at what time the webinar finishes, but I'm happy to stay and chat for a few more minutes if people would like.
Thanks, Batya. Yeah, we still have, I think we were a little bit beyond the time, but we're just going to make an announcement at the closure for the open call. I will open the mic to Carlos for his question.
Yeah, very quickly. I mean, thanks for the talk. Actually, taking the Twitter example, and the relationship between English and Spanish is 1.2. And there are some linguists that hold the theory that it is related with the Industrial Revolution, so that in England, they needed to have a more concise language for trade and for communication in that context. So there should be a correlation between technical or early technical development and conciseness of the language. But anyway, what I was going to comment is that I think we need to go beyond value-sensitive design. We need to go into value awareness design, in value-aware design, because values, as we have been discussing, are context dependent and cultural dependent, and values evolve. So having the idea that we have the values on the design table and that we design the product according to the interpretation of certain values is a complicated thing, because that will need to be redesigned constantly and will need to be adapted to the different cultural contexts. And it is not that we need to decide whether it is 140 or 180. So it has to be 140 for English speakers and 180 for these Rwandan speakers. So I think software and technology should develop in a way that it is aware of the values of where it is being used at every moment. So we as engineers, we need to have the aim of developing techniques that would make the software capable of adapting, self-adapting to the context where they are. I think we cannot go back to the design table every time there is a problem in a part of the world or in a community that doesn't hold the same values as the engineers thought they would uphold. So it is a challenge, but I think in artificial intelligence, we need to take that challenge as a next step. But that's just a comment for us. But thanks for the talk.
Yeah. So just in responding to what you're saying, first of all, I think that value-sensitive design has embedded within it the notion that values change over time, and that in fact, as we ourselves move through the lifespan, our bodies change, and the things that we value and how we balance those change as well. So within individuals and society. So you will find some tools and methods that may be helpful to you there. But one other thing I want to show you is this pencil is a mechanical one, but it could not just be a lead one. It's a tool that I use in so many different contexts and in so many different ways, often supporting things that I value. And there's something about its design that allows me, in the context of my using it, to make those adaptations. And I think that that's really important, that the technical system itself doesn't need to do all of the work. It can be supported by the human beings who are engaged in its appropriation and adaptation. And if you open up the design space to allow for that, you may, the burden for this kind of use and design may reside, you may find that you have greater possibilities for what it is that you handle technically and what it is you handle or ask the community of users to take up or the stakeholders to take up. So just a thought, a little seed to plant there, because as we know, the human condition is so complex and nuanced and subtle, and in human flourishing, we want to hold on to all of that complexity and subtlety. It's what we, I think, really enjoy about ourselves and our ability to live in the world. So thank you so much for your time and attention and allowing me to have a little window into your project. I wish you all the very, very best of luck and success as you go forward. It's hard work that you're doing. I just want to acknowledge that and encourage you to be courageous as you do that work, and you know, go slow. If you do a small bit really well, I think that will be more successful for you than tackling, you know, large problems, but not getting any one of them, you know, really done well. So that's also another, I think, helpful design strategy. So thank you so much again for your time and attention, and Paula for inviting me. And I know you have some other things. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Batia. Thank you so much for staying overtime with us. I'll just quickly share my screen again, because as a closure, I would just like to invite you to a follow-up, if you will, to this webinar, which is a webinar that will take place tomorrow at 1:30. Again, it's a matter of subjectivity, but it's a European, Zurich, Brussels time. In which you can find out all the details about the open call that we have currently running, which is an open call for experimentation with the platform and the app that have been developed so far within the project. You can see the link in front of you, and it's also in the chat. And as I said before, the recording for this and the presentations will be shared soon. Thanks again, everybody, for taking part in the webinar. Thanks to all the speakers. Thanks again to Batia. And I wish you all a good rest of the day or a good evening, depending on your time zone. Goodbye, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.